Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The SAS made their name in the deserts of North Africa, but less well known is after that they continued to fight in the Mediterranean theatre, carrying out raiding missions in advance of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, and then operating behind enemy lines in the Italian campaign. For this episode, I'm joined by Malcolm Tudor. Malcolm's father actually fought in Italy during World War II, and his Italian mother's family worked with the partisans and aided escaped Allied prisoners of war. Malcolm is also the author of SAS in Italy, 1943-1945. But before I start, I'd like to take a moment to thank all those people who have become patrons of the podcast. They help me find the time to work on the show. I hope you guys find the extras that I make exclusively available to patrons interesting. If you're not already signed up, it's super simple. Go to patreon.com/WWII By becoming a patron, you commit to $1 or $2 each month. In return, you can bask in the rosy glow of satisfaction from helping me fund the podcast, whilst listening to the extras that I put out that are history related, but perhaps not specific to the current topic. To find out more, go to patreon.com/WWII You'll find a short video there of me explaining how it works. Malcolm, thanks for joining me. Let's get started. If we go back to the original SAS unit in North Africa, how was it used? What was the original idea behind it?
Well, let's start with David Stirling. And in 1943, he was a prisoner of war at Camp 5, which is in Piedmont, in the fortress there. With the Italian armistice and surrender in September 1943, he was involved in one of his 5 escape attempts. Unsuccessful, and he was deported to Colditz. But I've found out quite a bit of information because I was in contact some years ago with one of his companions on his 5th escape, and it turned out that David Stirling was put in a cattle truck that was made of metal, and the guy I was in contact with was put in a cattle truck made of wood. As a result, all the people in the cattle truck made of wood jumped out towards the mountains and escaped, and poor old David Stirling and the remainder of the crew got taken off to Germany. So, there's a lot of coincidences in this story, Angus. Now, going back to Africa a minute, which was the point of your question, David Stirling was captured in Tunisia, and he was captured on 24th of January 43. He's flown to Italy, imprisoned briefly in Rome, and then sent to Gavi, which was the bad boys camp for people that the Italians thought were riotous and disorderly. Now, going back then to North Africa, the actual SAS then was the creation or inspiration of David Stirling. I mean, you can't deny that. Obviously, it was created with the help of a lot of his chums because they were quite an eccentric, and they crossed the bounds. I'll put it in those terms at present, and we'll come to examples of it as we go along. But anyway, and this is important, he came from a Scottish gentry family, we would say, so he was well connected, and he's a fascinating character. He was a one-time want-to-be artist in Paris, and then he went through the commandos and super brigade called Lay Force in North Africa, and then he heard from one of his pals who was Evelyn Waugh, the famous novelist, who's also written quite well about warfare in his novels. But anyway, he said that Lay Force was being disbanded. Now, David Stirling at the time was in hospital. He'd been practicing parachuting completely unofficially with another of his chums, Jock Lewis, who again was a big part in the creation of the SAS. And David Stirling ended up being injured, and he spent his time, instead of eating grapes and looking at the nurses, working out a plan which he called Special Service Troops as Parachutists. So parachutists were there right from the start. He then gate-crashed Middle East headquarters, and by coincidence he went to the office of one of his family friends, General Neil Ritchie. 3 days later he found himself before General Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief. So he just got out his memorandum, and they probably thought, oh, blimey, this young chap, because he was only 25 at the time, is he completely bonkers? But then they decided, no, we've got to do it because obviously the conditions demand it. And he was given then permission to form L Detachment. That's his first name. And he was given quite a good recruitment policy. He could recruit from lay force, which has just been disbanded, and from forward elements in the desert. I think you mentioned to me once about the establishment of the force. Well, it was quite high. It was over 500. So that's quite a substantial force for somebody who's gone in as a lieutenant, been promoted to captain, and been given this vast enterprise to form. I think the situation, the history in North Africa has been well established, really, and well documented. But briefly, most of the fighting was in Libya, which has been an Italian colony since 1911. And I must just say, one of my family's relatives was captured by the British in North Africa. He was an engineer, lieutenant, and then he was captured and sent off to India. So I had family members on both sides because my father fought in North Africa as well. So, but anyway, that's a deviation. The SAS, the first parachute operation then, which David Stirling led in person and planned as part of his package that he gave to Auchinleck, was a complete failure, in his own words, a complete failure. They lost many men, mainly because of the weather and the vagaries of landing by parachute in the desert. But over the next year then, they went on, to, as we know, they took out, it's estimated, almost 400 enemy aircraft. And by the autumn of 42, which coincided more or less with the second major offensive of the British, the force was renamed 1st SAS Regiment. So that's David Stirling in North Africa. I think, you know, they're characterised by their splendid raids with jeeps and, highly modified jeeps with Vickers aircraft guns on and all that. So
what I find amazing is at this time of the war is that someone like David Stirling could walk into a room and say, "I've got this great idea for a unit," and they listen and they go, "Okay, we'll give it a go," because it's not just him that's done it. There's obviously Ord Wingate does it with the Chindits, and there's I think Popsky's Private Army somewhere in the Mediterranean doing, you know, sort of something similar sort of things. So it's interesting. There's a willingness to try these things out, these slightly harebrained sounding ideas.
Well, I think Angus, it's the same in Italy. When you're getting bashed by the enemy right, left and centre, it's all hands to the pump, basically, isn't it? And there's also the fact, obviously, that David Stirling had been briefly an instructor in Scotland. He'd been in Commandos, lay force. So it's just that our ages, perhaps we don't think that 25-year-olds, but I mean, they're par for the course at that rate, you know, at that time rather. And what you do with a man like Rommel storming about, and just to say finally about the war in Africa, you know, when you read about it and your experiences, you know, the tank crews and everything else, it was terrible conditions. So, you know, I think they had to improvise. That's the word, improvise.
So with the Germans surrendering North Africa and Stirling is missing from the unit, you know, in many respects he had been the sort of the driving force at pushing it. It could have easily, presumably, been swallowed up by another unit or, you know, amalgamated into the regular army, but somehow it carries on, but it does change, doesn't it?
Well, the important thing to remember is that from its formation, it was outside the main army form of command. It was directly answerable to the Commander-in-Chief. So it had quite a few powerful friends, although once, as you said, once the campaign in North Africa had finished, obviously Italy after a while was going to be the main target. So a lot in the High Command Middle East headquarters wanted to do away, apparently, with these, they called them the funnies, didn't they, all these irregular forces. They wanted to do away with them, basically. Another thing I should have mentioned, really, David Stirling, in his formulation was that a force of 4 troop of commandos, numbering 200 men, could mainly do such and such, whereas if you divided that into 4 and 5 man units, with the element of surprise, you could do a tremendous lot more. But equally, for the Sandhurst-trained officers and all the rest in high command, it was a logistical nightmare having units of 4 and 5 storming about the place, getting in the way of regular troops, to be blunt. So what happened, instead of keeping the first SAS in the form that it was intended, or was adjusted to in North Africa, they took away certain elements of it. They took away the French SAS, sent it to the UK. They sent the Greek Sacred Squadron to Palestine, and the very important Special Boat Squadron, they give back its independence. It had been swallowed by First SAS in August 42, and they give that its freedom. I had the benefit of seeing Captain the Earl Jellicoe in London one time, and he's a splendid chap, leader of the Special Boat Squadron. And the remainder of the old First SAS, they first of all made it into the Special Raiding Squadron. And I looked up the numbers, because I think we mentioned those once. They're about 300, so quite a lot smaller, really. But equally at the same time, they formed the 2nd SAS Regiment. So while poor old younger brother David Stirling was enjoying Italian hospitality, his elder brother William, another great character, and obviously the same privileged background, was given a 2nd SAS Regiment, which was formed in Philippeville in Algeria. That sort of duality of operations continued. So you had Special Raiding Squadron in Italy, and you had 2nd SAS Regiment, which was based in Algeria and still sending operations or mounting operations in Italy right through the rest of the war. So we've got to mention Paddy Mayne, haven't we, now? Another great character, and this book is full of fascinating characters who I just love. And I must say as well, not only officers, because we tend to concentrate a lot on the officers, but the men were absolutely salt of the earth, the British squad. They just, and the way they adjusted to conditions after Africa to Italy is amazing. A lot of the ordinary soldiers came from very poor backgrounds, and they really excelled in the SAS, which is great. But going back to Paddy Mayne, anyway, he didn't come from quite the established background of David Stirling and his brother, but he came from Northern Ireland, Protestant family. He was a giant of a man, member of the British and Irish Lions. Let's get in for the rugby. He, a splendid athlete, and but he didn't seem at school. He just thought he was bookish and rather quiet. Then he joined, after a number of other units, he joined the Scottish Commando on Arran, and with the rest of them, he sailed out. My father sailed out as well from Scotland in a regular unit, but they all sailed out anyway from Scotland in early 1941 through the Bay of Biscay, fought in the Lebanon, and during this period he had two little bouts of, might say, irritation, because he knocked his commanding officer down, first of all, and another time he chased all his comrades out of the mess with a bayonet. So he's quite an interesting character. And David Stirling went to see him when he was held in the Middle East barracks in Egypt and the Nile, told him about SAS, and then persuaded him to take part. So from November 1941 to December 1942, you have Paddy Mayne always leading from the front, always leading by example, jumping on beaches that have been mined, taking out mortar crew single-handed, all that sort of thing. So, obviously a great leader. However, at the end of this period, Stirling was actually planning to send Mayne to the Lebanon to undergo ski training with his men, mainly because there was a fear that the Germans might break through Iran and through the Caucasus, etc., and pose a threat to the Middle East that way, but it never transpired. Anyway, at the end of the period, just after that, going back to what we said about whether the unit was going to continue, Paddy Mayne was summoned to Middle East headquarters and had to put up a good case for Special Forces continuing. But unfortunately, this was early 43, just after David had been captured. Unfortunately, he took offence about a news reporter, famous family, who he said had never been near the sound of gunfire. So he went smashing up restaurants in Cairo and never found the man, but at the same time, he threw 3 military policemen down the steps of a famous hotel, so he was in jug again, basically. However, again, through connections, I think, he was released and given command of the Special Raiding Squadron. And off they went to Palestine then, ready for the invasion of Sicily. I think we're going to mention training, but they never saw a landing craft. It was the first time they saw a real landing craft when they were up the coast, ready for embarkation. But they had landing craft made out of sandbags, mock landing craft made out of sandbags to practice with. Anyway, Special Raiding Squadron then took part in the capture of Sicily, and operations then on the Italian coast at Taranto, and Operation Devon, the famous and, well, infamous really because of heavy losses, the Battle of Termoli, which is the greatest SAS battle in many ways, although it was with commandos and regular forces as well.
Who gets inserted by submarines? Because before we start, when I was talking about the guns of...
Yeah, we mention submarines. We can, the island raid.
Well, because that's why I was looking at Guns of Navarone, because I was sure there was a war film with a submarine, and that mission that is a real classic Hollywood film in the making. Is where they're inserted by the submarine. What was that mission? Once
they decided to take Sicily as the first prize and the soft underbelly of the Axis, as Churchill called it, they decided then, obviously, Italy we know is a boot shaped peninsula, but obviously there's hundreds of islands in Italy, and so they thought, but this was second SAS. These were second SAS operations, these were. Again, we've got a great character in Harold Tanky Challoner, who was a famous detective in London latterly, and he obviously had, I think, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, which became terrible for him. But again, he wrote about his experiences. The first one was Operation Marigold at the end of May 43, and as you said, they were inserted by submarine. Basically, they were to pick up or to leave a notebook for collection by an agent and attack a German guardhouse and take one prisoner. But unfortunately, one of the men, when climbing the cliff on Sardinia, dropped his rifle, and then the German guardhouse exploded into life, and they all had to flee. Unfortunately, this was Challoner's first baptism of fire, so he was rather disappointed. He was just waiting, he said, to kill one of the enemies. Very disappointed, didn't get a chance to kill anybody, but he said more experienced hands won the day. But it's terribly funny, really, some of these things. But once they got in the, I think it was inflatable to return, the other chap in it was paddling the wrong way, so that was right. A contemporaneous operation was Operation Snapdragon to Pantelleria, another island, small island. This was more more of an engineered product. They were to find landing places for the invasion force and to gain intelligence and take one prisoner. But again, they had to climb a cliff, and they captured one prisoner, but his screams alerted the rest of the Italians, and again the SAS had to retreat fairly quickly, and unfortunately the prisoner they were taking, they dropped him down the cliff and he broke his neck. So that's terrible, really. So two operations that were failures, really. Apart from, as we said, people like Challoner getting experience of operations and no doubt a bit of intelligence. The third one of these was the final one on this mini island routine, Operation Buttercup, and this was by motor torpedo boat and canoe to the most southerly of the islands, Lampedusa, which you might have heard of in the Mediterranean context with the refugees and immigrants and all that, Lampedusa. They put quite a crew together to carry that out. They went by motor torpedo boat and canoe. Another character, Tony Greville Bell, who was a lieutenant. He came from Australia originally, but educated in Britain. And he's written quite a bit in his reports. He's got quite a quirky sense of humour. He said, "It didn't occur to the planners that the radar station would pick us up as we approached it. As soon as they got to 300 yards from the shore, a green flare went up and all hell let loose." So that wasn't too successful, right? I'll give you a final one on this run, Angus, which was successful, and got a personal interest in this. 10th of July, as we know, it's the invasion of Sicily, the main invasion. And I'm just mentioning this because it is one of these low-level island raids, really, although it's in the context of the whole Operation Husky. Roy Ferran, again, great character, who keeps popping up throughout the story. Roy Ferran, either in North Africa or in Italy. He was born in India and Irish stock. His father was an airman in India. Again, he was only, I was looking at this yesterday, he was only 24 when he ended the war, so very young. But anyway, he led Operation Narcissus, which was mounted from Tunisia, attack on a lighthouse at Cape Passero, which was housing an artillery observation post. Just below was one of the assault beaches, main assault beaches. The Allies basically landed in the south east of the island. And anyway, this was a complete success. There was a lot of firing, which continued into the following morning. The troops that landed on this assault beach were thereby secured, and among them in the Royal Signals was my father, Sergeant Kenneth Winston Tudor. So jolly glad that the SAS had got there first and taken out the lighthouse with the artillery post. Otherwise, perhaps, well, it would have been a lot different for us. Maybe I wouldn't be here. So,
indeed. I think some of these island raids sort of highlight, and certainly we'll see when they parachuted to Sicily, how the SAS are having to very much, I don't know if relearn their trade, because is quite fair, because they're obviously aggressive and motivated and well trained, but these are all slightly different necessarily than sort of zooming around the desert and picking and choosing their targets at, not at will, but when they wanted to attack them. They're very much more prescribed operations, and we'll see this with Sicily. Now, the parachute drops for the airborne for Husky are pretty dreadful, really. Was it the same for the SAS when they go into Sicily? Were their drops much more effective?
Well, I think, as we said, they started off as a parachute force, basically, didn't they, in North Africa? Yeah, there's more necessity to parachute in Italy. Obviously, the coastal situation was more limited in Italy because it was well policed by the Germans effectively once they occupied Italy in September 43. The parachute training was fairly basic all along anyway. I looked this up. The Roy Ferran had about 5 days hard physical training on the ground and 5 drops over 48 hours. Challoner, same place it was in Algeria, had 3 daylight drops, and that was it. In the end, he had to do a night drop, so it was rather a surprise when he dropped into Italy at night. But they were quite pleased because they received their wings after 3 drops and an extra 2 shillings a day pay. But I think some of them actually made their first parachute drop on operations, which is almost unheard of, but that's true. And several broke their shoulders as a result. In Operation Tombola, for example, and they all fell in the middle of a village, and one of them fell on top of an Italian signora, and he was quite pleased because she was rather buxom, so he was safe and she was safe after as well. So, but with parachuting, it is a difficult enterprise. There were obviously some fatalities in general parachuting anyway, and again, some great wit in the SAS coined the song "The Boys Who Ride the Slipstream," which Roy Ferran features in both of his books in slightly different versions, but I reproduce it at the start of my book. It's quite a few verses, but this is the last 1.5, and it says, "If our parachutes don't open, then we get there just the same. There's a big court of inquiry, and the packer gets the sack. But all the juries in creation can't fetch that poor chap back." So they knew there was a risk. But the boys who rode the slipstream coined this, and I've included that, and I put it at the end of the book as well, the mention of that phrase, because I think it's that sort of humour. My father, he always said, which is what soldiers say, if the bullet's got your name on it, that's it. So there's certain fatalism in the story as well, which we'll come on to really with some of the terrible episodes. But that was rather a long way of answering your question about Husky. But yes, there were several operations by parachute in Husky, and they weren't effective really. They sort of wandering around the island lost. Actually, the poor SAS men, they didn't contribute, but certainly the SRS, as we will see in a few minutes, were certainly very active in Sicily.
I have to say, it does seem like the great panacea did parachuting in on Husky, and then across the board it seems to have been a real damp squib for almost universally everybody. So their role is changed from the desert into much more of these pinpoint attacks. And on Husky, I think that they're going in just ahead of the invasion force. Is that the SRS going in with Paddy Mayne, just going ahead to?
Well, I think that was their. I think that was the intention. I think it was all hands to the pump, because if you look at the composition of the invasion force for Husky, it was so vast. I think it was 3,000 vessels for a start, hundreds of guns, hundreds of tanks, thousands of men. So General Miles Dempsey was commander of 13 corps, one of the 2 corps involved. He said himself he was only lent. I cottoned onto that word. He was only lent the Special Raiding Squadron. So somebody in their command in North Africa thought, we'll just add, we got complete coverage, so we'll just add this one unit that's done well. We'll just add them and see what happens. But in the end, they were sent to take out coastal batteries at the north of the assault beaches. The assault beach where my father and Roy Ferran were in the middle of the section. But anyway, the northern section was dominated by these coastal batteries. Paddy Mayne, again, with his men, complete success in this. They took, I think, hundreds of Italian prisoners and eliminated the batteries. blew them up, actually. So after that, General Miles Dempsey himself said, you were to have been returned to the Middle East. So instead, they went on to take the port of Augusta, which is one of Italy's main ports, and then another fishing port, Bagnara, which was impeding the progress north of the invasion force, and finally Termoli, which was a terrible battle. Roy Ferran was his little unit from 2nd SAS was at Termoli as well. Everybody seems to have, any importance seems to have been Termoli. And he said it was the only purely infantry battle that he ever fought, and he never wanted to fight another again, because they were pinned down near the station, and 3 days in the cold and all the rest of it. And it was a terrible battle. Kessel Ring had taken the Panzer Corps. They'd been taken off the field and were doing their bit to be combat ready again. So he just told them to march across the mountains and force the Allies into the sea, basically. But it was a terrible battle. I think you're quite right, Angus, about the use then. So that's the use of the unit. And in fact, they had 30 men killed in action altogether, the Special Raiding Squadron, 54 wounded, and 22 prisoners of war. They were used as elite infantry, but I think that's what happens in a complex operation like Husky, really. I was looking at it yesterday, and some of the same complaints, if you like, have been made about the role in Afghanistan previously, so I think that's something that goes on.
Well, I wonder as well if it's a command structure thing where somebody sees them and doesn't like them, but somebody else becomes in charge and says, "Well, we could use those, throw them in," and they're a different person who was in charge who gave them leeway before, which happens with the Chindits when after Ord Wingate's not there to necessarily stamp his authority on, they sort of get used much more as elite troops rather than special forces. I know that possibly sounds nuanced.
Well, I think that because, apparently General Montgomery wasn't too keen on them, let's say that, all the time, but he was impressed by the performance. And then in Italy, Alexander, as has been noted quite often, he's an excellent general, but he was a conservative general in small c. And as I say, they called these irregular forces the funnies, so maybe...
You see, my assumption was that Alexander would be favourable to them because because Churchill liked them. That perhaps Alexander was more inclined to like them, but that is clearly guesswork and supposition with no foundation of me knowing anything.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute, because Churchill, yes, he was absolutely in favour of the midnight drops and all the rest of it, but. Sometimes I think, yes, they didn't like him interfering all the time, let's put it that way. Looking at the conditions in Italy, obviously completely different. I mean, in North Africa, it was mainly the coastal strip that was inhabited and very little interaction with civilians, but apart from some Italian settlers and some Arabs, obviously. You mentioned jeep operations. Well, there were two major jeep operations in Italy. The first one was by Roy Ferran, because he loved his jeeps. Operation Slapstick.
They're great names, aren't they?
Yeah, Operation Slapstick. Oh yeah, Churchill, by the way, he sent a memorandum to his men not to name operations in a silly manner, such as Bunny Rabbit. Obviously, they were running short because slapstick. Anyway, it was in support of the 1st Airborne Division. Roy Ferran unloaded his highly modified jeeps. They were state-of-the-art then, with all the Vickers aircraft guns on, and could, mount quite an effective operation in the squadron, which he had. So he penetrated quite a long way after the invasion at Taranto. Well, actually, it wasn't an invasion as such, because the Italian fleet had come over to the Allies by then. But anyway, the Germans were all around, so I think he penetrated about 40 miles. But again, once he met German heavy artillery, and even mortar crews. He turned around then on command, and that operation came to gradual end. And obviously, in all these cases, as in Termoli, they were overlapped by the advance in regular forces. The second time jeep operations were important is at the end of Operation Tombola, when again the front was fluid because the general insurrection had been ordered by the partisans on April the 25th. So once that window was open, Ferran got all his, what he called it, the victory column in the end. He had 4 columns of about 3 or 4 jeeps in each, and in the end he put them all together, and they went rampaging around, firing at massive, oh yes, they had a howitzer by then as well, which they called molto stanco, very tired because of the effort they had to put in to push it up the mountains. But anyway, the poor fleeing Germans, Ferran's lot actually put a tremendous, think of the Vickers guns and the howitzer on German troops who were basically fleeing at that time, trying to get northwards. And so that was quite an effective, and he was praised for that, Roy Ferran, a very colourful character, again, praised for that, and by the Fifth Army. So those were two operations by jeep, but in fact they were quite well organised. The second phase of the SAS operations in Italy, Ferran even had 4 jeeps landed by Halifaxes to him before he set out, so that was quite an accomplishment, I think. But air supply was more of a feature, parachuting and air supply in Italy.
Well, they weren't very much working behind the lines, which is much more going back to what they were in the desert, aren't they now? They're much more raiding, they're much more given their own, I would say freedom's not necessarily quite what, because they have specific things they're supposed to achieve, but it's much more of that idea of raiding rather than pinpoint attacking. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
that's right. I worked out there were 14 operations of the type you described, which are raids, really. Once the Allies have landed in the south and established a royalist government in the south, and the Germans have occupied the rest of the country, there's 14 different SAS raids. The first raids were generally not highly complex. I think the most famous one is Speedwell. Speedwell, again, a misnomer really, but because the men were told not to have any contact with civilians and to live off the land. And when the ships were approaching Taranto in the south, once they heard that the Italian government had thrown in the towel and fled south, they talked about being in Rome in a week. So the planners, obviously in North Africa, thought that you didn't really need to sort out exfiltration. And also there were rumours that there were landings at Genoa and along the northern coast there. So exfiltration was not a great topic, really. Basically, the poor SAS men and generally the other agents, after a fortnight of living on their rations, they had to approach Italian people, obviously farmers, because it's mainly in the countryside. They had no idea, obviously, the language problems. They had no idea what reception they get, and they were surprised by a positive response and a friendly response. But the Italians, they'd had 20 years of fascism, and they're fed up with the war. And the fascists took their grain for a common store, took their sons for the war, and took their valuables for the war effort. So they weren't very fond of the fascists, really, and so there were quite a few friendly farmers that they could get a response from. That's true then of the first operations. They found friends locally. And obviously, people like my grandfather, he'd had a restaurant off Regent Street in London going back to Italy in 1931. So as a result, my mother was born in London anyway, and was a student at Venice University at the time of the war, and obviously escapers who came to our house in the village known in Italy were surprised. So there are quite a few return emigrants from Italy who spoke or knew England or Wales or Northern Ireland, Scotland. So, the response was positive, I would say. The only people they had to avoid, the SAS and all the others, were anybody obviously in authority, higher clergy tended to be fascist, or maybe some of the middle class, but the families, the noble families, the older nobility, were quite often quite Anglophile anyway. But so that was true then of the first phases. The larger operations in 1945, everything was sorted out by then, really, supplies and all the rest of it, special duty squadrons supporting the resistance, and also bombers in a supply role. And especially after the taking of Rome in the middle of 1944, that allowed the airfields in Tuscany then later on to be used, and you had Dakota aircraft supplying missions, SAS and resistance.
Well, I was quite surprised at these early missions. They never dropped in radios, but obviously they're doing the later missions for resupply, which it seems
only in 1945, Angus, because such confusion once Italy, as I say, the government and the royal family fled south, Germans took over, Allies invaded from south, total confusion. Nobody knew what was happening, basically, and for my family as well, one of the main things the escapers wanted to know was news of the military situation. Nobody knew what was going on, basically. And the lack of radios was, you'd have thought. But definitely the debriefing reports, they all have this one main complaint: lack of radios, lack of communication, lack of knowledge, as well as the usual complaints about the supplies are inadequate.
Well, I did make a note of the debrief after Operation Speedwell, where they'd suggested they should carry less cheese, which amused me.
They seem to have done quite well, actually, with their rations, but then they were thought of as they had a specific target, which involved a matter of days. Usually it was a railway line, a tunnel, something like that. I think the main objective of the earlier missions were to impede German reinforcements to the south. So to do that, you just blew a line, basically, which involved a matter of days. And so I don't think they were so concerned about a long-term supply at that stage anyway. But certainly in the latter stage, I mean, everything was organised in 1945. The resistance was organised.
Well, it goes back. It does go back again. This idea of raiding and hitting the Germans, where you're not taking on a large German force. So they do the same in support of the Anzio landings, don't they? That it's more raiding, impeding the Germans moving their material around.
They mounted, 3 or 4 operations, actually. This was towards the end of the first phase of the SAS in Italy, because then they all decamped to France, basically, in much of 1944. They had an operation called Maple Thistledown, which was to cut the railway line in the centre of Italy, and Maple Driftwood, which was to cut the main railway line along the coast, which, lots of us have been to Rimini and all the rest. Lovely, open, featureless, excellent sea for snorkeling, but very open. In those missions, they put quite lots of 17 men in Thistledown, in the Abruzzo, in 4 groups, all of which were taken prisoner by the summer. This was early 44. 8 men in Operation Driftwood on 7th of March. The 8 men took a boat and disappeared and never been heard of since. Very sad. Possibly, because they had to go south then by boat, possibly they were taken out by so-called friendly fire. We don't know, but... and there's another one in Tuscany, another group of SAS disappeared. So, obviously, in my later moments now, I will look into these. A third operation then in support of Anzio was called Baobab, and that was destroying a railway bridge on the railway line on the coast again, and that was a complete success. And finally, there was Pomegranate, they're great on names, Pomegranate in Umbria, which was to take out reconnaissance aircraft But unfortunately, the commanding officer was blown up by one of their bombs, Major Tony Widrington, and Lieutenant Quentin Hughes. The second in command was captured, but he subsequently escaped, and he provided a fine account of their mission, which again I got in the book. But so support for Anzio landings were problematic, let's say.
It is a wonderful account of that in the book. What struck me about that is these boys that are captured, they're seemingly, Italy seems awash with prisoners of war on the run at this point in time. But so Hitler's issued his commando order in I think 42, which instructs small commando groups to be handed over to the security forces. Presumably the SAS would fall into that category. If captured, they should have been handed over and no doubt shot. Well,
again, I've reproduced in full Hitler's infamous order. It's quite chilling when you read A. Hitler at the end of it. October 42. Again, I've done quite a bit of research in this. Operation Speedwell, unfortunately, it was divided into two parts, but the second, Operation Speedwell 2, the captain in charge and a parachutist, a sergeant and a lance sergeant, they were all captured, the 4 men, and 2 were executed under this so-called commando order on the Cisa Pass, and the other 2 were executed at Ponzano. The first 2, the commanding officer, they tried to bluff their way through a roadblock, but they did surrender. I'm sure they wouldn't have surrendered if they'd known about the commando order. I don't know, but and equally, the second pair just walked into a enemy bivouac on the side of the road by accident, loaded with all their sabotage equipment. The Germans definitely quoted the commando order. And later on in the war, there was Operation Cold Comfort over the mountains. There's numerous operations planned for the Brenner Pass, which seemed a good idea at the time, to blow up the pass and destroy the railway to stop German reinforcements to the south. But towards the end of the war now, when even the Germans obviously knew that the end was nigh, Captain Littlejohn and Corporal Crowley, they landed on the 17th of March in heavy snow. They landed in a German ethnic area, you might say, of Italy, and they were executed 2 days later. Conversely, during Operation Pomegranate, I mentioned Lieutenant Quentin Hughes. He was captured, as I said, when their bombs went off prematurely. He was actually saved from the Gestapo by a Luftwaffe intelligence officer and a German doctor, because the security service tried to get their hands on him, but they kept on putting him off. In the end, he escaped anyway. So they were good Germans as well, relative to the order. And during Operation Gallia, which was early 45 in Tuscany, 5 men, I think, of the SAS were captured, but they were captured by the fascists, the Black Brigades, the militia of the Italian Republican government, and they didn't subscribe in any shape or form to the commando order, and they were taken to Genoa first of all and then to Germany and came out at the end of the war. Oh yes, Quentin Hughes, he told the High Command about the order, but they told him it was a mere interrogation technique, i.e. a threat to a prisoner to make them
this was
speak up.
After he escaped.
Yeah, after he escaped. So I think Quentin Hughes escaped in May 44. So sometime after that, the SAS leadership made all their men aware of it.
It doesn't. You could say they're doing everything they could not to be captured. The Germans might have only made themselves a bigger problem.
Well, this was it's a terrible order. I mean, Hitler was quoting the Geneva Convention in favour of his decision. So it's a terrible order. Obviously, the Americans had the same. They lost men from Tuscany and from the same area of northeastern Italy in the mountains as well. And Germans involved were tried after the war.
Now they end the war, and this almost seems like to be like a last great hurrah for them. They're actually operating rather large units Would this be fair to say that, so like Gallia, there's 33 men, Tombola, there's a lot of them dropped in, but they're supporting the partisans, so they're still raiding, but from bases that are secured behind enemy lines. Is that how they end the war? Is that, or have I got the wrong end of the stick?
No, it's quite right. From the end of December 44, there was Operation Gallia, which was Tuscany, Cannock in Piedmont, Cold Comfort, which we mentioned in Bolzano, Tombola in Reggio Emilia, and Blimey in Tuscany. There were Blimey at the end of the five missions, but that arose because 2nd SAS returned under Roy Ferran, a completely new squadron, but part of 2nd SAS. Straight away, he went to the special SOE, Special Operations Executive, and by that time they had a headquarters in Florence and a friendly young commander, Charles McIntosh, who was again a bit wild. He wanted to get his hands on the enemy and not sit behind a desk. So when Roy Ferran, who was this slightly over-enthusiastic chap, turned up there, it was rather, hard luck on the enemy. But by this time, the resistance was highly organised, and the British and the Allies, really. British had a liaison officer, British liaison officer, SOE men were called, in each province and in every region of Italy, so occupied Italy. So that was the basis of great cooperation between SOE and SAS, and it worked out well. There were very few problems, and it was very complex. There's so many different agencies working behind the lines, but these two worked well together. Certainly, Operation Gallia was an impressive operation under Bob Walker-Brown, again a very committed leader. He worked closely with the SOE liaison officer, Gordon Lett. So really they worked closely together, those two, and as I say, they worked via the same Florence headquarters of SOE in Florence. So they were, parts of the same operation basically, and they were all under the operational command anyway of the 5th Army. It was a very large-scale enterprise anyway. By this stage, Roy Ferran could choose the men that he wanted, and a man called Mike Lees in the area that Roy Ferran was operating in, he was the SOE man, Mike Lees, and he actually had rearranged and reorganised the resistance in the area already. So when to his great surprise, Roy Ferran jumped, contrary to orders, into his area. He said, "Oh yes, I've been watching German headquarters down the road. Should we go and take it out?" So between them, then they got a chosen army really of the SAS, the Italian partisans, Russians as well, Russian partisans that were operating locally, and they did take out the 51st Mountain Corps German headquarters. And then, as we said before, Roy Ferran then got organised for the Jeep operations to end the war.
There are a wonderful set of stories of daring do, and some are more successful than others. Some are just abstract failures. But irrespective, that each one of those stories is a remarkable, absolutely.
I think to adapt to coming across from North Africa to Italy and doing so much. It was so uncertain. Everything was uncertain. And I think they did a tremendous job. One of my partisan friends took part in one of the charges that Roy Ferran took part in or led at the end of the war. And I said, "Oh, what did you think about these British coming across here and basically bossing you all about?" Well, he said, you've got to take your hat off to them because, they're laying down their lives to help free Italy, basically.
Well, now we've freed Italy, shall we leave it there? Malcolm, thank you for joining me. That was wonderful. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about the SAS in Italy, the book is SAS in Italy, 1943-45, by Malcolm Tudor. I will put a link on the website. Patrons, Watch out for more of Malcolm and I chatting, and if you're not already a patron, why not come aboard? It's patreon.com/WW2podcast. And don't forget to follow the show on Facebook. That's it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.